John Gerrard is best known for his commitment to large-scale works that take the form of real-time computer simulations. These frequently refer to structures of power and networks of energy that have made possible the expansion of human endeavor in the past century. Recent solo presentations of Gerrard's work include Solo Reserve, which we're going to hear about today, installed at the Lincoln Center in association with the Public Art Fund in 2014. In June 2016, a survey of recent work opens at the UCCA in Beijing. Thank you, John Gerrard. Please join me in welcoming.
Thank you very much, and it is good to be here. Thank you for inviting me to talk about the work. So I have about 20 minutes to talk, and I have 4 works to talk about. So I'm going to have to skip along pretty quickly. So I'm particularly interested in talking about the landscape and also about energy. And I'm interested to talk about an intersection between energy and information, effectively, and a sort of historical continuity between the past in the form of a work called Pulp Press, the present in the form of 2 pieces, a piece called Farm and a piece called Solar Reserve, and a sort of gesture to the future, which is a sort of conceptual flag, which I'm going to talk about last. So, the first work, Pulp Press, Kistefos, 2013, began when I was invited to Norway by a very interesting commissioner, Christian Sveas, and he asked me to respond to a derelict paper factory in Norway. And this is it, and it's sort of blends into sort of a sculpture park, but the actual building itself is unused. It opened in 1850 to produce paper and closed in 1950. And one must not forget that in the 1850s, paper was, of course, the great information substrate of its day. It was the sort of pulp was the internet of its day. So I sat looking at this building and wondering what to do as an artist. I was being commissioned to respond to it. And at that time, I was particularly making these oil pumps on the American landscape. And, one second. I'm trying to get this. So I was really working on a very, very different landscape. This is a portrait within simulation, within the virtual, of a found structure on the landscape in Texas. I was also looking at things like dust storms, which happened in the 1930s on the American landscape. So I really wasn't really sure what to do in this site. I visited a few times and spent time there with a writer and philosopher called Robin McKay. And finally, we began to pay attention to the river, which actually gave rise to the original factory. In Norway, they call this white coal. This is the power that flows down from the mountains to the sea, and originally, historically, gave rise to the paper pulp factory. So once we began to think about the river, I began to kind of think about this exchange of energy. This river is translated into paper as such, and then animates the contemporary world in the 1850s through to the 1950s. So literally, that energy was transferred by these belts back to this incredible machine, this pulp press. And the idea was to actually respond to this machine. So I found in the archive documents relating to the machine, and these are the bales of pulp that were produced and sent into the world, which were just so beautifully sculptural. These are all from the archive, images from the archive, which I dived into. So the idea was to actually recontextualize this memory of this machine as a virtual world against the river that gave rise to it, and for this scene to be powered by the river. So we proposed to build a pavilion, which you can see sketched here. And at the same time, I'm having some clicker issues. At the same time, we began to document the original machine, which was very, very beautiful, sort of destroyed. And then over about a year, we rebuilt the entire scene as a virtual world by hand. And by hand, I don't mean by hand in physical space, but by hand in virtual space. These kind of scenes have to be constructed. You can't kind of automate their construction. So I'm moving quite fast just to give you a sense of the construction of the work. In time, then we kind of finish it. This is the world coming to a close with the layer of paper flowing through it, as you can see. And then I'll just give you a sense of it. And the machine has been renovated within the virtual to once again produce these bales of paper. So simultaneously, we had talked to a company if they could actually simulate the production of paper pulp, which takes pieces of wood, grinds it into small particles, and then reunites those particles into paper. So that's what this sort of vision relates to. And they reenacted that process as a simulation for us, as a separate endeavor, which you can see represented here. And so every 25 minutes or so, the machine both creates it's creating a visual representation of the production of paper, and it's also creating an algorithmic representation of it, which you can see here. So every 25 minutes, you have a unique fragment of paper which is generated within that system, and each one of these is structurally unique. And we produced about 30 years of drives to store this work, which would flow from this virtual space. Each one has its own date and its own sort of notation in a way. You can see them in construction here. And so finally we get to the work, which is called Pulp Press Kistefos 2013. And it was installed, as I described, on this port pavilion designed by an Irish architect on a river. And the power that powers the projector and the simulating computer flows from the river. And here you step inside and you can see it actually running. How am I doing on time? So, and it's sort of nestled into the river. You can step around the projection and look out across the river. So here I just wanted to point out that those bales, at the point that they drop into the world, if you see down here, there's a drive. And this drive is illuminated by an LED, which signals the transfer of this fragment of paper from the virtual world to the physical. So it's actually written and stored there, which is why these drives build up in the space. So it's sort of hovering on that subject of data, the river producing information, which is then stored as a sort of a library. The next piece I want to talk about is called Farm. And it's a portrait of a found structure I found on the American landscape, which is a Google data farm. Data farms, there's about 6 of them on the American landscape from Google. And if you got here using Google Maps or use Google Mail, it probably, your information is residing in one of these 6 sites, or perhaps in all of them. So, you know, we are complicit in these sites. We're kind of involved in them. And I became very interested in them because of the sense that the internet exists here. It's not an Ethernet or it's not a cloud. It's actually an object which is connected to the landscape, which has energetic requirements. So, you know, our conception of technology and servers is more often this kind of thing, these kind of glittering server racks. But actually, it is these sort of structures along these lines. My second layer of interest was they were architecturally reminiscent to me of a group of pig farms, computer-controlled pig production units, also on the American landscape, that I'd found several years earlier. So I decided to make a portrait of this scene. This is the Google farm. These are actually diesel-powered generators that run 24/7 to provide backup power, and they've also coolers on the other side. So I wrote to Google and I asked, could I possibly make a portrait? And they said, absolutely not. I was also interested in this site in Oklahoma in terms of where does this data come from? Where does the information come from? So in truth, it comes from natural gas and coal for the most part, as you can see from the energy mix in Oklahoma. So in a way, the information here is kind of coal-fired, gas-fired power moving into the world and landing in your phone, which is sort of interesting for me that it emerges from this landscape. So as I said, I wrote to them and said I want to make a portrait of this place, and they said, please leave us alone. So I talked to the police in Oklahoma, and they said, you know, just have a bit of civil obedience and hire a helicopter, which is what I did. And I got this beautiful survey of the building, and we then we were chased by a little guy in a golf cart in case we landed. But I got this beautiful documentation, and we spent about a year rebuilding this scene as a virtual world. And you know, within the studio, my studio, we really work within this tradition of what I would say we call portraiture. So, you know, we create a portrait of this scene, and you know, the document of the real place is very important within a game engine, within the simulation engine. So in time, it became the work farm, Pryor Creek, Oklahoma, and this is stills from the virtual world. So this is moved into a game engine. The game engine is an annual world, so the sun travels over this. The camera also travels around it. So it's a portrait of this scene, depopulated. And in time, the sun goes down, it becomes night, as you can see here, and et cetera, across an annual orbit. So this was installed in Thomas Dane Gallery here in London and last year. And you can see it here installed on a freestanding projection wall. So I'm exactly midway through. How am I doing? Am I okay? Yes, okay, good. So I'm moving from, in a sense, information, which is emerging from the landscape in the form of coal, and then being transported from being coal or perhaps natural gas into information, which is then sort of animating our contemporary lives in the form of information. I want to talk about the generation of energy on the American landscape. This is a facility, this is a work called Solar Reserve. And in about 2012, I was approached by the Public Art Fund in New York. And they asked me really to respond to the city of New York as a public commission for the city, which is a challenge. I mean, the Public Art Fund is famed for commissioning people like Richard Serra, his Tilted Arc, Jenny Holzer, these kind of people. So there's a long history. But I really wanted to talk to New York about how, you know, its consumption of energy. So I was very interested in this scene, which is actually in Spain. It's a thermal solar tower, which are thousands of mirrors projecting sunlight to this tower, where salt is boiled. It's kind of gloriously biblical. Salt drains down, and this is utility at its base, which generates electricity. So this is a solar thermal tower. But I was interested in it because it just has this weird sort of mystical kind of feel, as if, you know, it's sort of somewhere between land art and a devotional structure, perhaps in Dubai, as it happens. And so I proposed to the Public Art Fund that I would actually find one of these facilities in America. Thankfully, they were building one in Nevada. This is it in its early iterations. This is Solar Reserve. The company is called Solar Reserve. The site is called Crescent Dunes. And so when I found it, it was just half built. They were just starting. So I had to kind of jump the gun a bit and rebuild it as a virtual world. So the proposal was to put an LED wall at Lincoln Center in New York in front of the Metropolitan Opera, and to put the wall in a way that it was frameless. It had no historical context, you know, in the form of like a kind of a sort of a barrier or a frame around it. And it would appear as if we had cut a hole in this scene to reveal something that lay under it or over it. So that was the proposal, and thankfully the company were very collaborative, and they invited me to come, and we took lots of pictures, and again we spent about a year rebuilding it as a virtual world, as you can see here. And again, you know, this is the virtual world in progress. It really is a portrait of each facility, each element within it, so it's laborious to produce. These are these enormous 200 square meter mirrors. I mean, they don't look that big here, but they're, you know, the size of an apartment. So interestingly, the layout of the actual Solar Reserve facility follows this golden angle, which you also find on a sunflower, which is the optimum way to derive energy from the sun on a flat surface, these particular curves. So we also followed that logic to rule our camera, to allow our camera to operate. And by that I mean it starts on the ground, our virtual camera within the virtual world, and it travels up over 30 minutes into space, where you see this beautiful solar disk, and it then takes 30 minutes to travel back down again. And this happens over a day, and over a week, over a month, over a year. So again, it's an annual virtual world which unfolds over time. So the piece Solar Reserve opened in New York in late 14. This is the LED wall. Every now and again, your sketch looks like your finished product. And this actually was the case here, that our sketch kind of they aligned, which is a good sign. This is this frameless LED wall showing the work. And here you get a sense of its scale. It was really an enormous LED wall. You can see a person standing to give it scale. And it ran, of course, Nevada time is a little bit behind New York. So as the sun went down in New York, it still was beautifully illuminated. And Lincoln Center is an incredible place to install something because you've got thousands of people coming each night to see concerts. So, and then gradually the two nights align until finally you have night in New York and night in Nevada. And this is just a video documentation of both the scene and the work and the public interacting with it. So as you can see, it was sort of catnip for the Instagram generation, and I have further evidence of that in a moment. And it ran for 2 months, and actually will stay in New York because the piece has now been acquired by the Museum of Modern Art. I have no idea what they will do with it because they acquired a USB stick, not the wall, just to say that. The wall was a bit more expensive. So these are some of the Instagrams. We call the one on the left Solar Jesus, then we got the Flying Baby, the Ballet Dancer, etc., etc. Ballet Dancer is one of my favorites. We all had yoga breakouts, and so anyway, public art, you never know what might happen. So the final piece I'm going to talk about within my 20-minute slot is called Flag Thames 2016, which I finished yesterday before I came here. And about 10 years ago, I, along with my father, dripped gasoline onto water outside my house in Ireland. And I was just fascinated by this sense of this kind of beautiful prismatic form, or sort of surface, and which was kind of redolent of, I don't know, this kind of peace flag or freedom flag in a way, but yet was sort of toxic. It was kind of both luxuriously sort of beautiful and obviously as gasoline enabling much of our contemporary comforts, but at the same time sort of deadly in a funny sort of way. So further research turned up these beautiful documents of gasoline on water. This is a drip of gasoline on water. It looks unreal, but it is actually real. And of course, this is Deepwater Horizon on the Gulf of Mexico, which creates these kind of similar sort of effects. So it's sort of macrocosmic, microcosmic interplays with the presence of gasoline in the world. And also kind of like that it felt a little bit like these sort of thermal maps of sea level changes and, you know, ice melting and these kind of things, which are very much going on these days. So I talked to my programmer, who's a wonderful man called Helmut Bressler, and he said he needed to simulate a thin film interference, which he spent about 6 months working on. And finally, he produced, well, in collaboration with me and others, this piece called Flag Thames, which is a little section of the Thames near Westminster, which we photographed and then rebuilt as a virtual world. And this object, this kind of thin film, is a physically correct representation of refraction. So it's sort of, as I said, exists, consistently developing over time. The edges are never possibly the same. They will always shift over time. And as with the other works, this piece unfolds over a year. So everything is in flux. And in a sense, it is a flag which truly unites everybody on Earth, because this really is the flag under which we live, I think. And so just to show you different senses, this is in the afternoon, this is in the evening, this is at midday when the light hits the water of the virtual Thames from above, so you can see its color more clearly. And with that, really kind of tracking a line from the landscape through the subject of energy and into information, and I suppose at the end, a sort of flag for the future. Because I'm not sure whether Solar Reserve is not a mythical structure or a dream structure on the landscape, a solar symbol, which looks very ancient, but is more of a sort of a dream than anything else. I suppose I end with this flag as really both the present and the future.